part of what we're looking for in a work of art is the way that the artist struggles against his or her limitations. Right. It's in the struggle against the limitations that really brings out the beautiful work. So people of different abilities can deliver art that hits just as powerfully, regardless of their skill set.
Welcome to the podcast, Tapping Creativity, with myself, Matthew C. Temple. And each week, we're going to dive into questions and issues and inspiration around creativity and the creative process. Hey, and welcome to this week's episode of Tapping Creativity, where I'm joined by a super special guest, Austin Kleon, who, if you don't know his name, you probably have seen the title of his book. He is the author of numerous best-selling books, including this one, which we'll be talking about today. This is the 10th anniversary gift edition, but he has a few other books on the New York Times bestseller list, including Show Your Work, Keep Going, and others. New York Magazine called his work brilliant, something that I have yet to get anyone to say about me, which is why I'm really excited to have Brilliant on the show with me today. He's also been called positively one of the most interesting people on the internet, and I'm not going to make him prove that here today, but I think he's going to show up. And if you've read his book or heard about it, you know that the Atlantic can't be that far off. So with that said, Austin, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So you're joining us from Austin, Texas.
That's right.
How's Austin, by the way?
The city or the person? The city is changing as it's been changing ever since I've been here. We're battling, I think it's becoming less and less affordable. So we're losing a lot of our really creative people. We're losing a lot of the artists and musicians who made the place special in the first place. Yeah. On the other hand, all the tech money and development is bringing some interesting things to the city. So it's good and bad. It's a crazy boom town. And I anticipate that it will keep changing the way that it has ever since I moved here 15 years ago. But we're holding on, and the sun comes out and spring is sprung here. So
love that. Yeah,
it's hard to be too upset when you can walk outside and get a taco.
Yeah, I've lived around the globe, and I've been fortunate to travel quite a bit. And anywhere you can get a good taco is a place worth spending plenty of time. But yeah, I'll say though, since we started with Austin, I think there's this thing of the artists, in some ways, the people that were there that made Austin, and part of what made Austin so attractive is, we see that all the time, this kind of erosion in some ways of that. Something comes up, and then of course, then where do people go? And that's sort of almost this migratory place, right? You go back into the early 60s and you had the East Village, and then in New York, and I don't know, there are a few artists that can afford to live there, but not most of the ones that I know.
Yeah.
So it kind of moves around. And
I mean, you see that all the time. Artists are always on the front lines of real estate because artists go where it's cheap and sort of vibrant. I mean, Patti Smith has a great monologue about this where she starts talking about New York City, and David Byrne, to a certain extent too, also says this. He's like, you don't understand what a dump New York was when we were there.
Right.
Just how rough but cheap it was, and the reason we lived there is because we could afford it.
Right.
And you see this over and over in different cities where it starts out as kind of a cheap, funky place to be, and then over time catches on, and all of a sudden it's not so funky or affordable.
Right.
I think Cleveland, Ohio has stayed funky. Places like that in America, I think, still keep their funk. And I still think that when I'm talking to young people, a lot of young people ask me, should I move to Austin? I say, I could never afford to live here now if I was a young person. Not with the ambitions I had. So you have to do what Patti Smith said, which she said, find a new city. She said, look to the places where things are happening. And one of the real joys of being, when I was going on book tour, back in the day is I got to see so much of the country, and there's so many cool things happening in cities all over,
Yeah.
and places you wouldn't expect. And so I think that's where you're going to see a lot more creativity these days, is places, and maybe not even creativity as much as people actually being able to make a life out of the thing that they want to do, to live free and do their own thing. I think you're going to see that in places more like Cleveland or Chattanooga or some places like that, Richmond, Virginia, or wherever.
Well, you kind of talked about that too in the book, which is, that location where you are exactly has become less and less important as we can be interconnected. And there's a little bit of a catch-22 there too, because as you know, community is also so vital. And it's something that, one of the things that I've found fascinating over the last couple of years is how much the dichotomy of that reality has become even more evident, which is you don't need to be anywhere in particular to do what you want to do. And yet at the same time, we actually need community. Like, we are not designed like leopards to live on our own in the woods.
Yeah. Exactly. It's a hard thing to navigate, and I do have to admit that Austin is a place that I've never been an evangelist for the city. I've never loved it as much as my wife loves it. But it's a place that's been really good to me. And I increasingly have to honor that. And it's slowly become a place that I love. And I think it's a situation in which if you pay enough attention to something over time, you can't help but kind of love it, because I think attention is a form of love. And I do find now that, in Austin, I know what the seasons do. I know what the wildlife does. I'm more in touch with that. When I first moved here, I was like, there aren't seasons. It's just hot and hotter, and that's not true at all, actually. I'm more fine-tuned. And so I've always been something that I say about Texas, because Texas, no matter who you're talking to, someone has an idea of Texas in their mind. And oftentimes it's something not so great in the news. But the thing that Texas has taught me as a creative person is, like, Texas isn't grand. It's like maybe if you go out to Big Bend or something, but most of Texas isn't grand the way it, like, the West is grand, So what Texas teaches you to do is to find beauty where other people might not be able to find it. And I think that's like a really, really, that has been a really, really, like, helpful gift to me, is to learn that there's beauty in places that you think aren't beautiful. You just have to pay enough attention to it. I think that's what, living here has done for me.
Oh my God, driving across like Eastern Colorado and Kansas is so boring. And it was like, well, if you're bored looking down, look up. The clouds are incredible. Or, there's like, I love going to the desert, and it's like, it's dry and you don't have trees and rolling hills, but look closely, like, sit down and just watch a little, square yard of the ground for a little while. And you're going to see that the amount of life there is shocking. It's just not big and in your face. And so it asks of you to actually hone your attention when it's not like, look how beautiful I am, big flowers, lots of rain, big trees, big mountains. It brings something different.
That's such a good point. And, the way that you just spoke about those different situations, it's like sometimes you have to pivot or look else to the side. Sometimes you have to zoom out, and sometimes you have to zoom in. So it's so much about attention. And I think that was actually, I'm someone who actually really loves Henry David Thoreau. I know it's kind of like for a while it was very cool to hate on Thoreau. But the great thing that I think he taught is that you can live in the same place your whole life and barely not go anywhere and pay enough attention to the place that you find the universe in it. The same way that Blake wrote to find the universe in a grain of sand. I think that's what the great artists teach us, is that it's not necessarily what you look at, it's what you see.
Yeah.
It's what you pay attention to, and it's what you notice.
One of your chapters in the book is about knowing what to get rid of, right? What to leave out. creativity is subtraction. And we're kind of talking about that a little bit because we're actually in a world now where you can like literally, I mean, in the last 3 weeks, I was on the other side of the planet in Kenya. I was in Turkey. I'm back in California. You know, the things that I saw, the pictures that I took, like this stuff is incredible. And yet, because we can get so much, because we have access to so much, we can actually have our creativity overwhelmed by excess, by not knowing what to leave out. Or I think you even have a quote in here somewhere too about like if you have everything at your disposal, you have like, how do you be creative or something like that? And I thought that's really so important.
Jack White of the White Stripes. I always loved that band because they did the simplicity of it: drums, guitar, and a voice. Black, white, and red. Yeah. You know, it was a threes thing, and the constraint of that, what they were able to pull out of it. And Jack White, you know, very famously said, you know, if you tell yourself you have every color in the palette, every tool at your disposal, that's just paralyzing because there's just too many decisions to make. There's too many ways you could go. If you start to give yourself some constraints and you start to limit or put some rules on what you're doing, all of a sudden it becomes much easier, you know, to get started. And it's actually it's very interesting because I don't know if you've noticed this, but it's like people of different abilities can deliver art that hits just as powerfully, regardless of their skill set. And I think part of that is what Saul Steinberg said, the cartoonist. He said, you know, part of what we're looking for in a work of art is the way that the artist struggles against his or her limitations. Right. It's in the struggle against the limitations that really brings out the beautiful work. So that's why you can listen to the White Stripes and it just pounds and hits on you. And you can also listen to a Beethoven symphony and it hits you, you know, but they can hit you with the same impact. And it really doesn't have anything to do with virtuosity or skill level. It really has to do with what the artist is doing with the materials they have at hand.
When I'm working with storytellers, and one of, you know, the things is you have to realize that in your life, you're going to have a lot of parallels with your protagonist if your protagonist is a good one and if you're honest about where you're at, because there's never been an interesting story written about some guy who graduated top of his class, got the perfect job, met like the perfect woman, they basically spent their lives doing everything perfectly. Like that's not a story. That's not a life. That's boring. And it goes into like our lives as creators. What you just said is that, sort of bumping up against your limitations, that fight, that place where you don't have the things you believe you need in order to do it. That's where magic can happen. If you have everything, you actually have nothing at all.
Yeah. And there's all these great stories of artists who are asked, how'd you do this great thing? And they have this very simple answer. One of my favorite is, I think it was Kurosawa, the film director. Somebody says, how did you get this shot? And he was like, well, if you turned to the left, you would have seen the studio building. And if you turned an inch to the right, you would have seen the river. So that's the way we did it.
I love
There's
that.
all sorts of stories like that. It's like, well, we worked with what we had and we made something happen. And I think I love those stories because they inspire us. We think that if we had everything, then we could really do our great work. If we just had the right studio or the right city or the right spouse or the right friends or the right tools or whatever, we think that we could really do the work that we really need to do, and it's really a matter of making do with what you have right now and then getting where you need to go.
I wanted to take a brief intermission from our fantastic conversation with Austin, and just to remind you that if you are being inspired by this and want to steal from an artist, but aren't quite sure how, or you're feeling a little stuck in any way, or you just have things you've been working on and you're feeling like, oh, there's something that I'm alone in on this that isn't flowing the way I would love it to be flowing, or you're just totally stuck, either of those, or any number of ways of going through a way of getting that flow moving again. We all have areas where we're stuck, no matter where we are. And sometimes creatively it's flowing, but perhaps some of the practical sides isn't, or vice versa. Anyway, I want to make sure that you are reminded that I always give everyone a free session to work with me to work through any of those creative challenges or blockages or just questions as they arise. matthewctemple.com/book. BOOK, to book a time with me. So go ahead. There'll be a link in the show notes or down below, matthewctemple.com/book. Book a time. It's totally free. We're going to have a lot of fun. I'll give you some great tools. And at the very least, we'll have a good time. And while we're busy having a good time, let's get back to this great interview with Austin. Continuing with this line of thinking, which is that routine is better than more time. And this thing that the limitations are actually beneficial. Like if we didn't have gravity, we would be like, our bone density would be such that we would dissipate,
Right.
like we need that. And I'm wondering if you can even sort of talk a little bit more about that, because when all these things come in, I've got a day job, or even if you don't have a day job, you have kids, you have a wife. And from anyone who's I've spent the last 3 years without a specific day job, without a specific project, without any deadlines. Like I'm like, I feel like I need to go back and get a day job, because like my days are so full and so busy, and yet I'm beholden to nothing and nobody. And it doesn't feel great.
Yeah. There's a writer named Wendell Berry who I think very highly of. And, he talks about interruptions and art. And he always says that the interruptions actually, whether it's a day job or whether it's your family or whatever, the interruptions actually provide the meaning for the art, because they're sort of like the interruptions are life,
Yeah.
And I always liked that feeling. But I do think that the routine, having some sort of daily practice, some way that you show up every day and you do your little bit of work, and that the day's work accumulates with the next day's work and the next day's work and the next day's work, and those days will add up to something. I think that grounds creative people in a way that it doesn't really matter whether they're unsuccessful or super successful. They know what they're going to do the next day. They're going to show up and they're going to do their work. Those were the artists that I have always looked up to and felt the closest to, or I felt were the most instructive, were the people that just kind of showed up and did their thing every day and then let those days accumulate. And, I think someone like Stephen King has always talked really well about this. It's like, 365 pages seems like a lot to write, but if you fill a page a day, you got them.
Yeah.
And just that idea of taking things one day at a time. It's not just for life. I think it's also, creatively, it gets you interesting places. And one of the things I think it does is it uses the natural power of the day to sort of get you through certain situations. So there's a great pulse of, and depending on whether you're a morning person or a night person, I'm a morning person. So in the morning, there's this great pulse of energy. It's like the sun's coming up and everything's fresh and new. And then at the end of the day, there's this real come down type thing. But there's a rhythm to that that's really restorative and regenerative. You go to sleep, and when you wake up in the morning, your problems look different.
Yeah.
Nice. And what you did yesterday looks different in the new light of the next day. And there's just such a power. It's almost like using time as a material. I think as an artist, you're always using time as a material, because time is the material of life.
That's really nice. Yeah, I think that's really great. And so that would means whatever time or whatever life throws at you is actually can't be a detractor from what you're doing, unless you basically decide that it is going to be the reason why you don't do something. But in and of itself, that's beautiful. And I hadn't heard that quote from Wendell Berry, but I like that a lot. It's great.
It inspired me as a person who's had a family for a really long time and tried to do this. there's a beauty in where they meet. Often art and family are presented as opposites, but they can meet and interweave in really beautiful ways that I think make for a rich experience.
Nice. Yeah, I like that a lot. So I'm curious, so this book obviously made a big splash 10 years ago. And I know it was 10 years ago because it says right here on the 10th anniversary gift edition that it was 10 years ago. Yeah. My little cheat sheet. What prompted the new edition?
Oh, great question. Gosh, what did prompt the 10th? I think, well, it had never been in hardcover, which felt like something. I think, the publisher, of course, you always want to move. I think the thing that was really interesting is it's a book that's continued to sell over the years. And so it felt like, well, we've got this model that's selling. Maybe we should spiff it up a little bit. Maybe we should have like a little bit more of a deluxe option. And I think that was sort of the impulse. It wasn't mine. I mean, I probably would have let it sit. But the publisher really wanted to do a 10th anniversary edition. Of course, I thought it was great. And then it became this idea. It became a very interesting question. And artists with long careers have to answer this. When you revisit old work, do you change it? Do you update it? Do you leave it lie how it is? Like, what do you do with it? And I sort of erred on the side of, I felt like this book was very much a crystallization of thought and energy from the particular moment that I wrote it. And the reason it's had such a life is because it has that kind of compressed, crystallized power that people kind of unlock when they open the pages. And so what I wanted to do, rather than try to revisit it or try to fix it or, tune it up necessarily, is I just wanted to add a little bit to it. And that was what the afterword was for, is kind of a look back on, what had happened in the past 10 years. Was the message less true or more true or not? And, the kind of thing that I came around to was the ideas in the book were so old when it was published, because it really does fly under the principles that it preaches, that it's a book that, brings together a lot of sometimes ancient ideas into a new package. I think the fact that so much of that stuff in there was kind of tried and true at the time that I put the book together, that it's just even more so now. So the afterwards sort of became a way to think about, why do things stick around? Why do books have lives? Who gives them the life? Because in my opinion, the writer does something, but then once the book is out in the world, their job is almost kind of over. It's really the readers that give the book the life. And to think about that, and what does that have to say about the creative process in general? And I think, mainly what it has to say is that you have everything to do with the making of the work and very little to do with the life it has outside. It's almost kind of like kids. It's like you sort of bring them here and you do what you can, but then they go off and they lead their own lives, and it's, I hate to think about books, actually, I wouldn't say books are like kids at all, only in the sense that the real life begins after they're here. They get here.
It's interesting you say that, and I've dealt with that quite a bit because, as a filmmaker, I spent, like, my last documentary, I spent 3 or 4 years working on it, and you kind of bust your butt. And at the end of the 3 or 4 years, there's this like hour and a half project that, that now on our premiere, it was a packed house and it was really exciting. And I felt great. And then everybody was gone.
Now
and
what?
I'm like, now what? Exactly. And then you're like, now I have nothing left to do with it anymore. Whatever this means now is out of my hands. And to any extent that it exists in the world, it exists the way that it impacts others and hopefully how they then move forward, so that the impact no longer has anything to do with me. It was like this little moment of time. And I think that's kind of a really important distinction, because from what I've heard from a lot of people, and I've felt this myself as well, you kind of put everything into a project and it gets out there and you have this moment of glory and everyone's like, oh, good job. And you get your distributor or whatever, it's published, it's out there. Yeah. And then you're like, uh-oh, now I'm left with like me again. And
Yeah.
I don't know how much what time I want to spend with me. Like, can I have my other people back?
Yeah, and I mean, like, I think when you're young, you think, oh, you'll get like when I'm old and successful or something, like this won't be a problem. And it's like actually it gets worse over time because, you really. That's why I think that daily routine, that daily practice, like knowing even if you win an Oscar tomorrow or hit the bestseller list, you're still going to sit down tomorrow and write, or you're still going to, sit down and do the work.
And your first draft is still going to suck.
Yeah,
right.
It's going to be bad. I mean, that's the thing about writing is it's like, if you watch David Hockney draw, I mean, like, David Hockney can sit down and draw, and he'll draw something perfect and beautiful on the first pass. That's drawing, though. Writing, David Rakoff said it always almost starts out like, he said it was like trying to reverse engineer a meal out of rotten food. He said it almost always starts out as trash. And writers, God bless them, it's like, it's just such a natural problem for writers is that it doesn't really get easier over time. It just changes. And the only thing you have to rely on is the previous experience that that you've been to these places before.
Yeah.
And that you just need to keep working. But as far as, I've talked to so many writers and they're like, yeah, every book is different. The previous one doesn't write the new one for you. And every time around, it's like being a baby again, trying to figure stuff out. And so that constant return to the beginning is something you just have to get. I think it's really helpful as a writer if you just abandon all notions of linear time. If you just start thinking about time in terms of seasons and cycles, if you can get in that circular mode of time, almost like a farmer or an ancient, agrarian person would think about it.
Yeah.
Just cycles and returns,
Interesting. I like that. And I think that you also mentioned that with writers that it doesn't get easier. And I feel like at any part that gets easier is not the artistry, it's the craftspersonship, as it were. Like at a certain point, you can draw a circle or you can draw a pear or you can draw Mickey Mouse a million times. And that's your craft. And that will get easier.
Yeah.
But the artistry of it, if it's gotten to the point where it's easy, it's no longer artistry.
That's why mastery for an artist isn't the most important thing. The most important thing is, are you able to go back to the foolishness of a beginner? Can you get back there? Can you find your way back there? And can you move with that? And can you find the next thing? Do you have the courage to go back there too? Because that's sort of where I'm at with this series of books. Steal Like an Artist was the first in a trilogy that continued to show your work and ended with Keep Going. And now the question becomes, can you do this again? Can you find the punky energy that you had for Steal Like an Artist and do your next thing? Or can you just start over again at all,
Man.
Yeah.
That's really great.
Thing that every artist has to deal with it. Every writer has to deal with it. And it's part of the gig.
I love that. That's exactly what I personally needed to hear today. So hopefully there's one of our audience members who got that lovely little bite-sized wisdom. So I heard or read somewhere that Steal Like an Artist started as a speech that you gave. And so if that was the case, that means you were giving a speech at a college. What were you doing before that point that made a college want to invite you to come speak about creativity?
So I really got my career started by being online. I had a blog that, sort of gained an audience over time. And then my first book was a poetry book that was made out of newspaper articles I had taken from the New York Times and blacked out most of the words and left a few words behind. It sort of looked like if the CIA did haiku, and there's a few of them in Steal Like an Artist. And so that was my book, Newspaper Blackout. And that came out in 2010. But I was doing that work like 5 years before then, and actually sold the book in 2008. So I had sort of become known for doing these things. But I've always been someone who writes about the creative process and my own struggles with it and the things I've learned. And so that talk that I gave, it was the biggest. It was sort of the biggest gig I'd ever gotten. It was with a community college in upstate New York, and they had asked me to talk to this group of students. And I mean, the funny thing was I wasn't much older than these students, really. I was probably 20. I'm 38 now, so the book came out when I was 28. So I was 27 when I wrote the talk, and I basically didn't know what to say to these people. And I went for a walk with my wife, and I said, what do I say to these students? And she said, well, the best talk I ever heard when I was a student was a woman got up and said, well, here's a list of 10 things I wish I had known when I was sitting in your shoes, when I was in your seat. And I said, that's great. I'll steal that. And so I just wrote this talk that was like 10 things I wish I'd known when I was 19, basically. And so that went over really well, but no one filmed it. And other than the audience who had it, it kind of was like, okay, did this happen or not? It's the classic millennial question. I'm an elder millennial, but it's like, if it didn't happen online, does it exist? So I just turned it into a blog post, just took the slides and the text and just made it into a blog post. And that was the thing that really went viral in a way back then where blog posts could go viral. And then it quickly became clear that this was going to be my next book. But your question, who would listen to a 27-year-old copywriter, is actually a very good one. And it was the question that the late Peter Workman, who ran Workman Publishing at the time, asked. He was someone who really didn't understand why would people take life advice from what he felt like was a kid. In hindsight, what I think is the magic of Steal Like an Artist is something that C.S. Lewis talked about. He said, a fellow student can teach another fellow student just as much as the teacher can. And the reason is the teacher's experience, they're up here, and the student is here. The fellow student who's just figured out the thing is still down here. And so she can talk to her fellow student in a way that the teacher can't. And so the expert is up here, whereas the novice is like, down here or depending on what axis you want to put them on. So the fellow student can teach another student just as much as the teacher can, because they can speak to each other in their own language, in a sense. And I think that is the magic of Steal Like an Artist. It's the energy of someone who thinks he's just figured these things out and assembled them, and now is letting you kind of look over his shoulder and copy.
Neat. Okay. So that was just like, do you feel like you kind of fell into that gig, or was it?
Yeah, it was luck, but luck favors the prepared, in a sense. I mean, it was very much, the talk was very much a collection of writing that I had been accumulating on the blog, so it was kind of a repackaging of things I had already written about before. And then the book really, the talk provided the skeleton for the book, and then the book was like the fleshed out version of the talk. So it's like I said, it's that it was accumulative. It was the accumulation of all this material that kind of Katamari balled or spiraled up into the bigger piece.
And you kind of said that too. It's like, luck favors the bold, the prepared, whatever it is. But the point is that we're actually all pretty lucky. I feel like I've been so lucky in my life. And yet at the same time, it's not also for lack of hard, things didn't fall into my lap. Well, some things, I guess, fell into your lap, but if something falls in your lap, you have to know what to do with it, or you have to be ready to be able to deal with that. Because there have been plenty of times where opportunities fell into my lap that I'm sure if I look back on, they completely passed me by because I actually was not ready or prepared.
Yeah, you have to sort of be ready to jump in and take the ride when it shows up. That was always my thing. I've never been good in my career at making things happen, of having a vision and then like seeing it through. It was always about, my career up until this point has always been like doing lots of things and then just kind of reacting it's just a lot of reaction, really. Just and you hear actors sometimes talk about that acting is reacting as much as it is like, putting something forward. And so I think a lot of my moves, really for the first 10 years of my career were about reacting, taking opportunities, letting things kind of come to me. And so I think the jump for me, the question is always, do you keep working in the way that's been working for you or do you try something different,
Right.
And every career has to answer that. But I guess the question to myself would probably be like, can you visualize something that you want to exist in the world and not just react? Can you make it happen? And we'll see.
Yeah. In this book, it's a collection of, well, you'd say sort of 10 principles that you wish you could have given your younger self.
Yeah.
And so that's what you did. But I'm really kind of curious, to what extent do you think that it would have helped and to know these things, and to what extent you actually had to live through those particular challenges to become the artist and the person that you are today?
Personally, now that I'm where I am, I wouldn't tell them anything, because I believe very deeply that you can tell. I mean, that's part of my experience of being a parent. You can tell people a million things, but they have to come to it themselves through experience. It doesn't hurt to have your, somebody's voice in your head. I mean, one of the Jedi mind tricks I realized that my parents played on me, years and years ago, was just repetition. That they repeat themselves constantly, and through sheer repetition, those voices would, speak to me later on. Mm-hmm. But it didn't really mean anything until I had the experience to match the words to, right? And so I think in some ways, books like this, like Steal Like an Artist, the best thing that the book can do is that you get about halfway through it and you get itchy and you want to go make something. That's the biggest compliment I get. It's like, I got halfway through it and I was like, man, I gotta go work. This is too, And I tell people, well, you're not supposed to spend like a week with this book and intensely. Like, you're supposed to read it in a couple hours and then spend a week working off the fumes you got, huffing from this book. But it's like, I think the thing that a book like Steal Like an Artist can do is sort of plant some seeds in your brain, and then as you water them with your own experience, and then they kind of take root and grow, I guess. Right. But I think it's the question of whether you think art can be taught, which is a whole different. Whether you think creativity can be taught, and how much you think anything can be taught versus experience. So
it's one of those things that when you get to, I'm in my mid-40s, and you get to this point where you're like, oh, I wish I had known these things before. At the same time, I couldn't have known those things before, and I get to where I am through the challenges, right? And we kind of touched on that a little bit earlier, is that your challenges is part of what actually creates the possibility for who you are in the world. You don't get to build muscles by like going to the gym and just lifting your hands up without anything in them. You need the resistance, you need the challenges. And I love what you just said, and I'm really glad you brought that up. So I'm going to underline it, which is that, if you read this and you're 19, like, it's good to have that in your brain. And yet at the same time, it's going to do it. What it's going to do for you is basically probably going to be, some guidepost. That way, when you get to certain moments, you can be like, oh, I recognize that from somewhere. Maybe I'm not the first person to have writer's block, or maybe I'm not the first person to have like imposter syndrome. Maybe this feeling lost and what the fuck am I doing with my life and whatever else is like, you're not alone. This is part of that creative process and the experience. And if you can feel that you're not alone, you're still going to feel alone, but at least there'll be a little bit of solace. It's like a little bit of a balm. And I think that's kind of what I grabbed from this too. And even kind of what you just shared, which is that, yeah, you got to read this book, which, by the way, you do have to read this book, and it is out now. Workman Publishing. You can find it pretty much anywhere where you buy books. Steal Like an Artist, the 10th anniversary gift edition. It won't fix any of your problems. And if you're feeling really stuck, it is not going to necessarily unstick you, but it will give you some pieces for a little bit of inspiration, as though almost if you're young, it's a goalpost to go to. And if you're a little older, it may be a reminder of where you are, or rekindle something within yourself that allows you to go and pull what you actually already know inside of you. And for that, I thought it was really beautiful.
Thank you. I couldn't have said it better.
Oh, well.
And I wouldn't have.
Well, I'm glad I said it then. Austin, this was just really fantastic having you on the show. Just congratulations on the new edition, on your process. It's super exciting. I'm glad to now have had this extra little window into you as the person, and you as the artist, and looking forward to future conversations. But in the meantime, thanks again. And for everyone listening and watching, the book's out now. Grab yourself a copy. It's beautiful. Besides, it is a gift edition. And this, one thing that Workman does so nicely is they make copies that actually feel really good. You're like, oh, somebody cared about this book. And that's one of the things I love about the Workman books, is that you feel like somebody really cared. It does feel like a gift, whether it's for somebody else or a gift you give yourself.
It's true. Thank you for picking up on that. And thank you so much for your time and for having me.